Most of us in ops are wired to overdeliver. In almost every situation, that's exactly what makes us good at what we do. But when it comes to launching something new, that same instinct can slow you down, cost the business money, and hand market share to your competitors. The goal isn't to build the best possible version, it's to get the right version to market as soon as possible. MVP, minimum viable product, means you don't need every idea on the whiteboard before your first customer says yes. And if you're not running a product team, this same pattern shows up anytime you're building or launching something new, a process, a system, a tool. Today, we're giving you 3 ways to find that MVP line and actually stick to it. Hi, I'm Penny Cook. I'm a fractional COO and strategic operations consultant, helping product and consumer brands install, upgrade, and run scalable operations and operational systems that reflect the founder's unique vision and ambition.
Hi, I'm Sarah Wilson. I'm a fractional COO and management consultant for founder-led SMB. I help businesses struggling with complexity and challenges within their operational core. I work with founders to install scalable, repeatable processes and unlock scale with the tools and teams they already have. Penny, I'm such a fan of this topic. I think I'm going to misquote a little, but you know how we say that perfection is the enemy of good or some kind of variation. This
It's
topic
the
is
enemy of
so
market share, right?
exactly. So this idea that we have to aim for perfection when we should be aiming for excellence, yes, but good enough even. And sometimes we say good enough is it hurts us inside. This MVP structure that we're going to go through is really going to help our listeners really understand what we mean about minimum viable product, and that the word minimum isn't the enemy here, and that it's really important way to think about it. So that brings us to the first tip, which is defining the scope before you build. Landing on the scope up front is really critically important in this process. So the brief is your most important launch tool. Defines what you're building, and just as importantly, it defines what you're not building. So it's, think of this as a one pager. It's what is it? What problem does it solve? And most importantly, what's in the first version of what you're building. Also, again, what's not in the first version that you're building. And it's totally okay to think about the next iteration and have that defined, but really getting very explicit about what that first version looks like is critically important.
Yeah,
So
Sarah, I so like it is so important, right, to understand what you're building and also really what you're not building and why. So this one pager that you're talking about, the brief, is the blueprint for success for launching,
yeah.
right? But if I have, we've done a great brainstorming session. We've got all kinds of ideas listed. How do we know which ones make it into V1, and how do we know which ones to hold off on for a future launch version?
And I think people listening will go through this exercise and have to put their critical thinking caps on. It's so easy to get really kind of emotional and attached to certain features and structure or whatever it is, product or process. One of the key questions to ask ourselves is, would this product exist or be usable without this feature? So that is one of those
Good one. Yeah.
baseline things we ask ourselves to really define really well what's in V1. And then, second, to move away maybe from the nice to haves and really define the difference between a must have and a nice to have is this feature core to what the product is intended to be? And then, third, really comes around the value proposition. So, would the customer pay for it without this feature? Keep in mind that list we just talked about that would perhaps live in version 2. We had defined it earlier in the process, but that's okay to have that in a future list, because keep in mind your customer doesn't necessarily know, or they aren't necessarily aware of or even expecting what features are living in that version 2 that you have going.
That's true. I think that teams can fall into some traps where they fall in love with features. And like you said, if you distance yourself from that, be really objective and ask yourself those 3 questions that you put out there, Sarah. I think that that really gives you an idea of what needs to be included and what can wait until later. And I love to tell teams, create a separate moment for that great idea. Let's get everything out to teach the market what this product is, to start to get customers onto this, and then create moments for, hey, we added on this great feature. If the product will stand on its own without it, and it's nice to have, let that happen, right? There's some traps that teams fall into with this, right? Like what can go wrong when we're trying to put this scope together?
Yeah, it can be. And I love, by the way, the idea of making a moment. Never heard that before, but I'm really a fan of that because it gives that feature maybe the air it deserves, the time it deserves, the attention it deserves. Doesn't mean we're rushing and cramming it into our scope, because one of the major traps is really that your scope becomes too ambitious. So either you're not going to be able, you don't have the budget for something that ambitious, or you just won't have the appropriate resources for that scope as well. So let that brief really be clear and is what we're sticking to, and it's the decision that we've made for what belongs in version 1.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That scope that's too ambitious is going to push on your financial boundaries, your budget, and your launch date. And getting the scope right is how you protect those things when you know what those are supposed to be out of the gate. And things like timeline matters more than what you might think, because every day between you and launch is a day of revenue that you're not making, and you cannot get that back. When you take that time, you're literally handing your market share at that point to someone else, which brings us to our second tip: set a realistic timeline and protect that. Timeline isn't just a project management tool. It holds the MVP line in place, and it provides a real achievable date that creates the pressure that keeps that scope from drifting, and it keeps that one more thing from happening. Without it, good enough to ship never arrives, right?
Yes, absolutely. And it's an easy trap, to use that word again, to get into, because as humans, we're biologically prone to add. This is what we do, is, our psychology is to add more, do more, and, strive for excellence. And it takes a fair bit of restraint to of course stick to that scope, but also to stick to that timeline, that
Right.
critical
It's a
timeline.
great forcing function, right? So everyone who's listening here, you already know how to build a project timeline. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about using that timeline to create that forcing function that really forces you to stick to MVP, to stick to your scope and deliver what you promised up front and deliver it well, right?
Yes. And so if we were to kind of continue to segue into the third piece we want our listeners to take away. So if your timeline is realistic and protected, it becomes, like you said, that forcing function. And that really brings us into the last thing, which is protecting that MVP line with clear decision authority. So important. Once everything's defined, is to have that stable, clear decision authority throughout the whole process, because it's that authority to make those difficult calls around what we're, for example, not going to do, that becomes one of the most challenging things of a project, is that that waffling that can happen, and that scope creep, and the feeling that we are slowly drifting away from the MVP line, and that can be very challenging. So very much needing to not only define
Yeah.
that authority, but ensure that the authority is, different levels of authority live with different members of the team.
Yeah, for sure. I think the PM, either the product manager or the project manager, whoever is in charge of the launch, Sarah, is the one making the tactical decisions. If tactics change, or if timelines without strict dependencies slip and things move around, the PM can handle those, right? But the sponsor is really who holds the line on the scope and on any big decisions that really change the character of the launch or the timeline or the budget of the launch. And this is exactly the role that we talked about in our previous episode around how to be a project sponsor. If you didn't listen to that, I would highly encourage you to go back and listen to that. And this is a great application of why that role is so important and what you can do to really support your team in getting the right product out at the right time. The go, no go is the sponsor's call ultimately, right?
Yes, absolutely. And, every function has a role to play within a project such as this. And it really comes down to, that sponsor having that no go, no go, for example. They're the ones having that clearly defined, clearly living with the sponsor from a responsibility perspective really lets us be honest throughout the entire build as to where we are, keeps the pressure up, but keeps everything realistic and moving at the right pace.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's such an important point that the pacing of the work, paying attention to these details, and really understanding who has the authority to let what decisions through as we're protecting the scope, the timeline, and any changes. So, and all the scope work and the timeline discipline in the world won't stick if no one is empowered to hold that line when things get hard, and they inevitably will. I mean, we all know that from our experience managing projects, launching products. Make sure
Yeah.
that person is named, map out the decisions that need to be made along the way, and protect the MVP commitment you made at the start to protect your business's ability to get this product out on the market, retain the market share that we need for the reason that we're putting this product out there, and get that revenue. Every day that you don't have that product on the market, you're losing revenue that you can never recoup. So,
And
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I was going to say that these surprises that affect. So when we consider thinking about keeping that discipline to go no go, just a note: surprises can kind of come from nowhere. They can seem small and then they impact the process. Like a reminder is, for example, if marketing's built campaigns that outline something different than was intended, or customer service wrote some support docs that have been made public that have something in there that's slightly different than what's intended. Those seem small, maybe in the moment that people are creating them. So that's where the clarity that we talked about at the start becomes even more important, because little things can become big things and then we end up scrambling. So just something to watch out for is making sure that all the different functions are clearly aligned.
I couldn't agree more. It's not one thing that's going to create success. It's these mesh of things that we're talking about. So just to summarize really quickly, define your scope, get the right features in your scope, and name the features that are not part of the scope and why. Ask yourself the tough questions to make sure the features you've included are the features that really should be MVP. If you're building beyond MVP, you are leaving money on the table, I promise you. Protect your timelines, get to launch when you said you were going to launch, make sure you're aligned for the other team's sake, and have clear decision authority where your project sponsor is really there holding the line on what MVP should be. And do all of that work up front, protect it, and ship your product. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've got a launch that keeps slipping, a scope that won't stop growing, or a team that can't seem to make the call, or if you just want to get it right from the start and commiserate with some people who have been there and solved those problems, this is exactly the kind of work that Sarah and I do every day. Please reach out to us. We'd love to talk. Hit the subscribe button wherever you listen so you never miss an episode, because
Great businesses don't just happen, they operate on purpose. Thank you so
thanks,
much,
Sarah.
Wendy.
Thanks.
Have a good one. Bye,
You too.
everyone.